So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Lena, who is assistant professor of law at Tel Aviv University, where she teaches not only Jewish but also Islamic jurisprudence. And one of her recent publications is The Beginning of Islamic Law, Latent Antique Islamic Legal Traditions, which is a book that explores how a critical historiography can illuminate the beginnings of Islamic law. And now she's going to speak on the topic of Jewish and Islamic legal traditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena, for the introduction. And thank you, Emily and Suzanne, for the invitation to be here. It's our pleasure to come when Emily calls. It's not that difficult. I'm even being recorded for Emily, which I normally don't like at all. So I want to actually begin, hopefully this always happens, which is that on my computer, the Arabic and the Hebrew work fine, and then the parentheses always get messed up. And I also want to apologize to those of you for whom this might be repetitive, especially Emily, because, yeah, I'm not saying anything new necessarily for Emily. So I want to begin with an explanation of terminology that represents the core argument of my talk. There is a distinction in both Jewish and Islamic legal thought between the notion of divine law and the human interpretation of divine law. So this is why Maimonides, in the original Arabic of his Guide for the Perplexed, used the term sharia to refer to Torah, which is divine law, and fiqh to refer to halakha, which is the human interpretations of divine law. Because the terms sharia and halakha have the same literal meaning of path or way, they are often equated with each other. However, the relationships these terms have within their systems of meaning are actually quite distinct. Based on their meanings, sharia is equivalent to Torah and fiqh is equivalent to halakha, which is the way that I've represented them on the slide. So my point here is that literal definitions of these terms do not actually convey their meanings, and their meanings can only be ascertained by defining the terms in relationship to other terms. This is a basic Levi-Strauss argument base. So in other words, simplistic comparisons obscure the relationships between Jewish and Islamic legal traditions. So what I want to do in this talk today is basically outline three disciplinary modes of simplistic and problematic comparisons. And these are comparative philology, comparative law, and comparative religion. And my basic argument is that these simple comparisons actually obscure our understanding of Jewish and Islamic legal traditions. And after that, I'll probably go into a little bit about the traditional Islamic perspective on the relationship between Jewish and Islamic law. Makes sense, obviously, that there's actually a discussion of this in the Islamic legal tradition and not really a discussion of this in the Jewish legal tradition just because of chronology. And if we have time, and we'll see how it goes, I'll talk a little bit about pedagogy and how I actually teach these things to my students. So first, 19th century European comparative philology sought to identify original Indo-European Aryan and Semitic languages in order to differentiate between Aryan and Semitic peoples. The comparative philological method involved placing languages in a vertical hierarchical relationship by comparing their vocabulary and grammar and grouping them based on the extent of their similarities. Now, the key structural aspect of comparative philology that I believe shapes the study of Jewish and Islamic legal systems is the Proto-Semitic family tree that I'm showing on the slide. I believe that much scholarship at a deeper conceptual level continues to perceive the relationships between Islamic and Jewish legal systems as embedded within this kind of linear framework that is structured like this Proto-Semitic family tree. So basically what happens is that scholars focus on identifying the derivative relationship between the older Semitic law, the Jewish law, and the newer or the younger Islamic law. The comparative philological method of organizing language families informed comparative law's method of organizing legal families. Some scholars of comparative law sought to pinpoint the legal equivalent of Proto-Indo-European, the original Aryan law known as the Urrecht. This in turn shaped the comparison of Jewish and Islamic legal traditions within this kind of derivative linear paradigm. When these conventional methods of comparative philology and comparative law are applied in the studies of Jewish and Islamic legal traditions, there are three basic significant consequences. The first is imagining a vertical tree in which Islamic law is derivative of its older Semitic legal sibling, as I alluded to earlier. Second is assuming that equivalent trilateral Semitic roots produce the same meanings by pointing to similar Jewish and Islamic legal doctrines, and I'll explain this in a moment. And the third is presuming that the grammar of both legal systems is comparable by pointing to how their scriptural texts generate laws. So let me then just explain how these conventional comparisons mischaracterize the relationship between Islamic and Jewish legal traditions. And I'm going to use a specific case study, which Emily's familiar with, circumcision, just because it's very easy to sort of do this theoretical work through a specific case study. It's common for scholars and the general public alike to assume that the Quran borrowed ritual laws such as circumcision from the Bible or from Jewish law. But biblical circumcision, although it began chronologically earlier, was quite distinct from Islamic circumcision. So late antique Muslims didn't actually borrow circumcision from the Bible or from the Jews. Instead, Muslim scholars regulated circumcision in dialogue with both contemporaneous and predecessor practices, which included tribal and other customary practices. So despite the Bible's specificity in discussing circumcision, there are actually no Quranic verses that explicitly mention or require circumcision for Muslims. And so I have on the board some verses, and I know whenever you do this, you put text on the board, and everybody looks at the text, and they stop listening to you, and I apologize for this. But I can't keep switching, so this is why it's there. I didn't want to put in a blank slide. But the basic question then is, why do Muslims circumcise? And there are two reasons. First, circumcision was a regional customary practice that was not overruled by the Prophet or any late antique pious figures. So in other words, circumcision was simply what people in the region did. And second, circumcision came to be understood as what's known as an Abrahamic requirement, reflecting broad regional understandings of Abrahamic practices. So as I note on the slide, there are actually approximately 70 instances in which the Quran refers to Abraham as an exemplar who should be followed. And some of these so-called Abrahamic verses became the basis for identifying circumcision as an Islamic legal obligation. And so these are the four verses that became very significant in justifying circumcision. So Quran 2:124, and remember that God tested Abraham with certain commands. Quran 2:135, they say become Jews or Christians if you would be guided to salvation. Respond, no, the community, millah of Abraham is true and he was not a polytheist. Q 2:138, the baptism of God and who can baptize better than God. Q 98:5, and they have been commanded to do no more than worship God, offering him sincere devotion, being true in monotheistic faith, to establish regular prayer and to practice regular charity, and that is the right and straight faith. Okay, so the point of this is that, as you can obviously tell, none of these verses actually mention circumcision, right? There's no clear reference to circumcision at all. And from a historical perspective, if we were to go into the details, which I'm not going to bore you with, but they're it's in chapter 4 of my book, these Abrahamic verses were simply unlikely to have referred to circumcision at the beginning of Islamic history. 7th and 8th century exegetes actually did not associate circumcision with these or any other verses. So that's Ibn Mujahid, Muqatil, and Ibn Abbas. So by comparison, in the 10th century, you get At-Tabari, who's a very famous and important exegete, historian, and jurist, who mentions circumcision as a monotheistic obligation in the exegesis of all four of these verses. So when you compare verse by verse, you see a very significant shift historically. So what this suggests is that there was a historical shift in the interpretation of these verses, a historical process by which these verses came to be understood as Abrahamic, and a historical process by which they became to be understood as legitimating circumcision. And I suspect that justifying circumcision as an obligation became necessary actually as the empire expanded into areas where the majority Christian population simply did not practice circumcision. And so here it's also important to remember that there's a difference between minority, majority in terms of numerical numbers and in terms of power, as Emily alluded to. Okay, so these conventional methods have obvious implications for our case study on circumcision. The comparative philology, comparative law method would result in perceiving Islamic circumcision as first derivative of its older Semitic legal forefather Jewish circumcision, second, having the same meaning as Jewish circumcision, and third, as being based on equivalent Semitic canonical ideas, specifically Abraham's covenant with God. So that's why it's commonly assumed that Muslims adopted the practice of male circumcision from Jews, and like Jews understood it as representing Abraham's covenant with God as depicted in the Hebrew Bible. And just alluding to our conversation in the break, this would be like the reporter's question, right? The reporter would sort of think of circumcision along these lines. And then the question is always, well, how do you deal with the reality that this is such a common and prevalent way of thinking, but it's just not historically accurate? So what we might describe as the comparative and philological approach is what I've put as the first 3 points. But when we actually look at the historical evidence, we see that first, pre-Islamic Arabian circumcision practices were just as significant precedents as Jewish circumcision, if not more. And second, that ritual purity and not the covenant was the key issue in terms of understanding Islamic circumcision, and that what underlies Islamic legal reasonings for circumcision is actually issues about grooming. And so the way that Muslim jurists legitimated circumcision was that it was one of the things you needed to do in order to have a clean body, literally, not just metaphorically. So the conventional methods of comparative philology and comparative law are actually related to the method of comparative religion. The founders of the modern discipline of comparative religion were philologists, who perceived the study of language as corresponding to the study of religion. And so just as comparative philology placed Semitic languages in linear, vertical relationships, comparative religion placed Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in linear and familial relationships through the very problematic notion of Abrahamic religions. So what you see on the slide is 2 such renderings. And the point I want to make here is that these images help shape not only the scholarly view of circumcision as an Abrahamic practice, but obviously the popular views, because for most people, this is what is in their heads, and this is what we sort of have to teach against, and this is what we have to try to nuance. Okay, so if we actually looked at the textual sources, and I don't want to get into too much detail of this, and that's why I've kind of summarized it on the slide, we see something very different from the kind of linear vertical relationships that I've described in the images that I've presented to you. So in Jewish texts, you have the very specific explicit source. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between you and me. And that's Genesis 17, verses 10 to 11. And of course, you have lots of rabbinic commentary on circumcision, and many rabbinic texts emphasize the importance of circumcision such that it can even violate basic Shabbat rules, Sabbath observance, right? So things like using the knife, which you normally would not be able to do on the Sabbath, you can do when it comes to circumcision. By comparison, in Christian textual sources, you get the letter to the Galatians, and Apostle Paul develops the notion of spiritual circumcision as an alternative to bodily circumcision. Specifically, Galatians chapter 6, verse 15 says, in it, Paul suggests that the spiritual circumcision supersedes not only the ritual circumcision, but the broader commandments that it represents. The point here being that for Pauline Christianity, spiritual circumcision isn't just replacing bodily circumcision, it's replacing all of the biblical commandments that Jews are sort of overburdened with. And there's a way in which dialectologically Christians are really engaged with the Jewish precedent. Now, by comparison to this, when we actually look at the Islamic text, as I pointed, there's no Quranic verses explicitly mentioning or requiring circumcisions. There's only these 70 instances of mentioning Abraham, and those verses, as I noted, weren't even really understood as requiring circumcision. And there's no historical evidence that at the beginning of Islamic history, circumcision was incumbent upon converts or was even relevant to Muslim identity. So the point is that this slide summarizes the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic textual references, and each tradition articulates a distinct practice of circumcision, even though it's in dialogue with other traditions. It's not in dialogue in a vertical sense. So despite what may appear to be a consensus on the practice of circumcision, each tradition discusses it distinctly. Whereas biblical and rabbinic texts identify circumcision as a legal obligation, Islamic scripture does not. Whereas Christian texts identify spiritual circumcision as an alternative to bodily circumcision, Islamic scripture does not deal with either biblical circumcision or its spiritual alternative. So if we were to focus exclusively on the biblical notion of Abrahamic or on the comparative religion paradigm of Abrahamic, we would not understand how circumcision operates within the Islamic tradition. In other words, to understand how circumcision was interpreted as being part of the Islamic tradition, we actually have to take into account regional customs, as well as obviously the Christian reception of the Bible. The point here is that identifying male circumcision as an Abrahamic practice imposes boundaries on historical inquiry while seemingly engaging historical ideas. And here, this is, I think, where the trick is, or the trap, really. The ritual of circumcision is understood differently. Muslims did not justify circumcision with reference to the biblical covenant. Instead, they identified circumcision as an obligatory practice for the 3 primary reasons that I've already mentioned: that it's an Abrahamic practice, that it's necessary for ritual purity, and that it's part of what's called the natural predisposition, which is fitrah. And fitra is a complicated concept because it varies by genre, but it basically means bodily perfection. And it actually is similar to the way that the Maimonides justifies circumcision. Maimonides talks about circumcision as being necessary to make the male body complete. And so it's not an accident that it's Maimonides in the Islamic context who talks about it most explicitly in terms of the rabbinic tradition. So the point is that the Islamic tradition recognizes circumcision as being much more than just an Abrahamic tradition. So whereas for Jews circumcision represents a covenant with God as depicted in the Bible, and the ritual of performance of circumcision is invested with symbolic meaning and is viewed as essential to Jewish identity, for Muslims circumcision represents bodily purity and is necessary for cleanliness. This is why that the performance of circumcision for Muslims is not invested with any symbolic meaning. And the details of when and how the circumcision is performed are really matters of customary practice. So a key demonstration of differences between Jewish and Islamic circumcision is the issue of blood. In the Jewish tradition, the blood of circumcision has ritual meaning. In the Islamic tradition, it does not. And these dissimilarities reflect not only differences in Jewish and Islamic legal traditions, but also the historical basis for circumcision in each tradition. So let me offer just a very specific example just to think through these parameters. How Muslim jurists grappled with Jewish law on circumcision is kind of an open question, and I want to give you the specific example of Leviticus chapter 12, verse 3, which specifies, "On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised." There are two other biblical references to circumcision that specify a precise date: Genesis chapter 17, verse 12, and Genesis 21, chapter 4. So those biblical references specify 8 days, with the exception of Genesis 21, chapter 21, verse 4, in which Isaac is described as being circumcised as 8 days old. And by comparison, for pre-Islamic monotheistic Arabs, and possibly for some ancient Israelites, there's some evidence of this, circumcision was a puberty initiation rite. So not 8 days old by any means, but actually at puberty. So as a result, some late antique legal authorities advised that circumcision should take place on the 7th day, while others advised against it. And some traditionists actually reported that Abraham circumcised Ismail when he was 13 years old and Ishaq when he was 7 days old, again reflecting the Jewish-Muslim kind of dialogue on the date. And while there is some interest in differentiating between Muslim circumcision and Jewish circumcision, there's actually no clear Islamic legal ruling on when Islamic circumcision should take place. So as a result, by the medieval era, Islamic sources provide multiple opinions on the timing of circumcision, which range between 7 days and puberty, and thereby actually correspond to both pre-Islamic customary Arabian practices and to Jewish practices. So although Muslims accepted circumcision, they did not understand the biblical law about the 8th day as applying to them. That's pretty clear from the traditional sources. All right, so that's been kind of a broad overview. I want to switch now and to give you a very brief description of how the Islamic legal tradition understands the role of Jewish law, because there's actually a section in Islamic jurisprudential texts that discuss whether or not Jewish law can be used as a source of Jewish law. Beyond that, there's actually another sort of way in which Jewish law could play a role in Islamic jurisprudence, and that's exegesis, which is the second point. The first point is that medieval Muslim jurists debated the possibility of using Jewish law as a source of Islamic law, and Islamic jurisprudential texts identify 3 categories of Jewish law: those that were upheld, those that were modified, or those that were mentioned in either the Quran or in the Sunnah, meaning the normative practice. So the first category, Jewish laws that were explicitly or implicitly upheld, includes monotheism, paying charity, and fasting. The second category, Jewish laws that were modified, includes, for example, Quran chapter 16, verse 146, which modifies biblical dietary laws by prohibiting fewer categories of foods. So the consensus of Muslim jurists was that these 2 categories, Jewish laws that were upheld or modified in Islamic scriptural sources, should be accepted as part of Islamic law. There was basically no disagreement on these issues. There was relatively more disagreement about the third category, which is Jewish laws that were merely mentioned in the Quran or in tradition reports. So a very often cited example of this is the Quran chapter 5, verse 48, which mentions, actually this is Quran chapter 35, verse 35, I think, which mentions an eye for an eye, a phrase that appears in Exodus 21, verse 24. So although Muslim jurists discuss these three categories of Jewish law, this doesn't imply, though, that Jewish law played a major source of Islamic law. I just want to emphasize this, that this is a matter of discussion. It's an intellectual discussion. There are some issues in which Jewish law gets incorporated in Islamic jurisprudence, but when you look at the behemoth that is Islamic law, this is sort of a drop in the bucket. Now, an additional means by which Jewish law could have been adapted within the Islamic legal tradition is exegesis. Some Muslim traditionists who had converted from Judaism or who were familiar with biblical and rabbinic texts reported narratives and scriptural hermeneutics in what came to be identified as Israelite stories, Israeliyat, which all of you are familiar with. But I need to point this out. There's no systematic study that has examined how Israelite stories informed Islamic legal doctrines. And so it's actually not possible to determine what extent Islamic law adapted Jewish law through those Israelite narratives. And I suspect it's actually marginal in terms of what its actual effect on doctrines. So the point is simply that Jewish law plays a minor role within the expansive Islamic legal tradition, even though it's recognized as playing a role. See, that's my alarm. Okay. I have to stop now, even though I have more. But it rang, so that's it. Thank you.
So very disciplined. So we do have time for questions and comments. Yes, please.
Thank you. Very interesting. One issue one has to take a little bit into consideration is the nature of the texts. So if you take the Torah and the nature of the Torah, from a philological point of view or from a jurisprudent point of view. So when you read the Talmud or you read the Halakha, the Torah is one big, but you can also look at it from a history of religion or a philological point of view. The Torah was produced probably around after the exile in the form we have now. It had a certain function, whereas the production of Islamic law was within an Islamic empire where you had the king and the ruler. So you had different circumstances to compare the texts. So one way of sort of taking a double round mistake error is in if one were to say circumcision is something common among Semites, let's say, and then defining that the only way that Jewish tradition has it is through the view through the Torah, as we have it now. Yeah, could be a double check, because circumcision evolved also within Jewish, Israelite and Jewish societies before we have the Torah in its present form.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the chapter, which goes into more detail, I talk also what I think is more significant in terms of the changes in Jewish practice on circumcision is actually the Christian polemics against it and the Roman persecution and the Greek persecution of circumcision, right? Because the whole rules on the Priya and the cutting and the excessive cutting has to do with responding to the fact that there was reverse circumcision that Jews practiced in order to avoid being identified as Jews. So obviously all of that goes into the dynamics. When I teach Jewish and Islamic legal reasoning, one of the things that I do is put up a picture of a cherry and a watermelon. And I'm like, Jewish law is the cherry, Islamic law is the watermelon. And it's not like comparing apples and oranges, because one is like this behemoth thing, 260 billion something people, right? And one is a much smaller tradition. And the issue isn't about, the size or the comparability in that kind of sense. The way in which they're similar is obviously, as you pointed out, Islamic law has always existed with a state, coincided with the state, and Jewish law did not. So they're totally different in that respect. But from the perspective of legal reasoning, what makes them both similar is that their scriptural sources act as centrifugal forces for legal reasoning. And the hand that actually does the legal reasoning, the adjudication and the jurisprudence, is the hand of the jurists in both traditions. So basically, both of these traditions are non-state legal traditions, right? They existed before the modern nation state. They'll exist after the modern nation state is passé. They function in similar ways, obviously at different scales and with many, many, many differences. But in the world that we live in, the comparison is always going to actually be between secular law and these legal traditions. And so that's why it's significant to put them together. And that's one of the things I talk about in the book extensively. Sorry.
I'm going to ask you a general weird question, but how do you conceptualize, how do you use Israelite? Because, I mean, it is such an important link between the two traditions. You mentioned explicitly that it should not be understood as a legal source for Islam. I've always read what I've read of it as sort of, in a different ways, how to draw the distinction between, I mean, how, not to show some sort of, quote unquote influence, but how to show what Islam is not. How do you conceptualize Israelite?
Okay, so now you're giving me an opportunity to talk about the next slide.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I think Israelite is really complicated. And what I want to push against is the kind of simplistic ways in which people sort of try to identify something as being Jewish and then claim that it enters Islam. Because part of what I do in the book is talking about what I call about the craft of legal recycling. So you need to understand Muslim jurists as taking these artworks, recycled artwork, right, and then putting it together and fashioning it into a new piece of art. And the attempt to find or identify the composition of each component part in the artwork is, I think, inherently suspect. It's not something that we should be doing as scholars. Even though we do work with it, but the idea that somehow we can measure it, I think, is impossible, right? That's my main point with the Israeliyat, is that I don't think we can measure really its influence. And the example that I have on the board is about the kind of more subtle ways in which these things occur that we need to pay attention to. So you have Quran chapter 24, verse 2, which states very explicitly, the woman and the man guilty of adultery or fornication, flog each of them with 100 stripes. This is a very explicit text. Within the Islamic legal tradition, there is a historical claim that this verse was abrogated by the practice of the Prophet because he stoned an individual. When you read the story, the individual he stoned was Jewish. He admitted to committing adultery. And in the narrative, the Prophet claims that he is applying biblical law, right? He doesn't claim to be applying anything else. He says, where's the Torah? He finds what the biblical law is, it's stoning. Okay, so you see Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 24, you shall take both of them, the adulterers, to the gate and have them stoned to death. So the question here then is, and this is an open question, and that's really the point, is stoning a Jewish law or an Islamic law? When the Prophet stoned Ma'iz, this particular individual, was he applying Jewish law or was he applying Islamic law? It's not a question that even the jurists have a clear answer for.
If I
Yes.
remember the story correctly, he tells him, what's in your book? The
Yes.
question is,
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
my punishment?
Yes.
And the guy told him, it's like, and he told him, no, read what's in your book, and in your book it's stoning, and so he stoned him. So the principle I would understand from this story is that if you're Ahlul Kitab, then you apply your book to yourself.
Yes, and that is understood as a general principle.
That's how I understood
Right.
the story myself.
But it's also interpreted this way. And so who's going to be the deciding factor? The point is that, we're scholars, we're not theologians. We should not be in the business of deciding what is Islamic and what is not Islamic. Okay, the point is that it is an open question. It's an open question within the tradition itself, and that there are these subtle ways in which these things interact. And so I wouldn't want to describe the story as being Jewish law being applied or Islamic law. I think that it needs to be left as a question. It needs to be left as something that is not clear and that people will understand within the tradition differently. Somebody might come and say, this is an example of Israeliyat. This is an example of Jewish law influencing Islamic law incorrectly. Somebody else might come and say, no, this is an example of what I mentioned before, which is a Jewish law that is, this one, a Jewish law that is mentioned or a Jewish law that is upheld within the tradition because it's in the Sunnah, right? So it's an open discussion, basically. Sorry,
In
Emily.
the case the woman isn't stoned then, and it's just the individual, you said.
In that particular historical claim, I don't think that it was only
Either of
him.
the two, okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Can I just make a brief comment from my contemporary setting? I wonder how much of this tendency to sort of perceive this as Semitic traditions that comes from the contemporary setting. Because Jews and Muslims in our contemporary societies have sometimes joined forces when it comes to sort of arguing for the right to continue practicing circumcision. And that's why we sort of read that into the historic setting as well. I remember once in my apartment building, we live in a neighborhood which is very a substantial Muslim population, and my husband, who's a minister in the Church of Sweden, encountered a friend of ours, Lena, who's a former cantor of the Jewish congregation here in Jerusalem, and in Stockholm, sorry, who's also a muhayyad, a circumciser. And he was there going to visit this Muslim family in our apartment building to circumcise their baby. And my husband was called in to assist in the circumcision, which was his first time. And because there are so few Muslim circumcisers here in Sweden, so the Jewish mohel was sort of act on behalf of the Muslims as well. And very often they have seemed to sort of join forces and argue for this right to religious practice.
Yeah. So in the contemporary context, what you're pointing to is the racialization of Jews and Muslims, which is a completely different field, right? And when we talk about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, it's certainly the case that there is Muslim-Jewish alliances in secular Western European or Western states in general on these kinds of issues. But in those cases, that has to do with secularism and the way in which secularism is biased against Muslims and Jews because they don't fit into a secular Protestant-based Christian understanding of religion, right? And I have a work on that. A chapter on that, basically.
Yes. Actually, we have to move on to our next speaker. I'm sorry, I'm keeping on time here.